last night. We're going to start off with bill introductions. Does anybody have bill introductions today? Seeing none, is there any bill introductions from the public? Seeing none, I do have one. I have 23 RS 0244. And this pertains to working after retirement legislation for IDD providers. Any questions or objections from the committee on that introduction? Seeing none, we will consider that introduced. All right, committee, we're going to start off today, or our only business today is an informational hearing on ESG. You guys have probably heard ESG has been in the news a lot lately as it pertains to the financial industry, the pensions, and state governments. So I wanted to give the committee a refresher course for some, but also an informational hearing on others who are not too familiar with ESG. I do want to clarify that currently there is no ESG legislation before us. There has not been any ESG legislation submitted to the Senate or the House. So this is only an informational hearing. Now, I assume there will be ESG legislation to come down the road, but as of now, there is none. So this is not a bill hearing for any particular ESG plan whatsoever. I do encourage everybody here to ask as many questions as you can. Feel free to chime in, raise your hand during the presentations. I want you guys to gain as much knowledge as possible before we go down the ESG road later on this session. So that's what we're here for today, just to learn about ESG, the pros and cons, what other states are doing. We want to make sure that there are no unintended consequences of any legislation that comes out of this committee. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Melissa Rennick with Legislative Research for a breakdown on basically what's happening in other states with ESG, what ESG is, what's going on the federal level. Melissa does have, if you brought your laptops, Melissa does have some testimony as well as a rather thick appendix, 70 pages, I was told. So Melissa, take it away.
Thank you, Chairman Hoheisel, committee members. The memorandum really is an opportunity to introduce the committee at both a high level as well as a focused look at the individual detail levels on this broad topic of environmental, social, and governance standards, and how those standards intersect with topics and issues before the Kansas legislature and other state legislatures. So the first part of this memo will focus largely on investments and those screening criteria used by some investors regarding potential investments. What you see is not a conclusive list of all of those state laws. The chairman referenced the appendix. That's where you'll find some of those state bills and legislation, as well as some other statements by public officials. This is intended to provide you a few, for example, representative examples and responses to a series of questions that we've posed regarding ESG. So the first question, what is ESG and how are these standards used to screen potential investments? The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission defines ESG investing as a way of investing in companies based on their commitment to one or more ESG factors. So those potential factors that the SEC has identified include risk and opportunities associated with the impacts of climate change on the company, its business, and its industry, the company's relationship with people and society, and how the company is run and its executive compensation. Now, how that looks in practice, investment advisors and registered funds, who are termed as investors here in the memo, both retail and institutional, could then apply ESG standards to their investment strategies. ESG considerations will vary between investors, and some investors may only focus on a specific criteria within a very specific factor. Investors' interest in ESG factors has increased in recent years, with a reported growth in U.S. sustainable investments from nearly $640 billion in assets under management in 1995 to $17.1 trillion by 2020. The end of this last decade has seen the steepest growth in the total amount of U.S. domiciled assets that are integrating these ESG strategies, growing from a reported $12 trillion to $17.1 trillion. In consideration of these assets that are using or considering ESG criteria, this equates to about 33% or $1 in $3 of total U.S. assets that are professionally managed. So on the second page of the memo, we take a couple of the investor strategies. What does it look like? How would they incorporate ESG? So there's two examples of asset management by investors who utilize ESG factors to inform ESG integration: BlackRock and Goldman Sachs Asset Management. So BlackRock uses what it terms as ESG integration, and Goldman Sachs uses ESG and impact investing. For BlackRock in 2020, they committed to putting sustainability at the center of their investment process, based on a conviction that integrating sustainability related information into its investment process could help its portfolio managers manage risk and make better informed investment decisions. BlackRock's statement is that investment firms follow the same principles in their approach to ESG integration. This means regularly reviewing exposure to ESG risk, using a breadth of sustainability-related data and analytics to develop investment-related insights, providing transparency about how sustainability-related information informs their portfolio management practices. Taking this apart a little more simply, for BlackRock, ESG may include or cover environmental. So for the E factor, climate risk, natural resources scarcity, pollution and waste and environmental opportunities. For the S factor, social, labor issues and product liability, such as data security and stakeholder opposition. And for governance, items relating to the corporate governance and behavior, such as board quality and effectiveness. Looking to Goldman Sachs Asset Management, or Goldman Sachs, a recent 2022 statement on ESG and impact investing provides that for Goldman Sachs, ESG factors are important for identifying investment risk and capturing opportunity. So for their investment teams, they choose to analyze ESG information in a manner that is consistent with their investment style and specific strategy guidelines. They may use this to set exclusions, drive tilts, or seek to select certain securities that have strong ESG ratings. Using this framework, this also means a commitment to promoting and exercising effective stewardship, in Goldman Sachs' words, and the elements of its stewardship approach are taken in the key areas of proxy voting, direct engagement, and industry leadership. Much like with BlackRock, we can take apart some of the ESG and eliminate some of those, focus on those factors. And so for Goldman Sachs, E, or environment, would include water usage, waste generation, energy intensity, CO2 emissions, footprint, and CO2 intensity. Social could include gender diversity of the company's workforce and UN Global Compact compliance. For governance and compensation, board quality, including board independence and board term, and minority shareholder rights, including controlling shareholders and or unequal voting rights. So, taking the consideration of how an investor approaches ESG, the next part of the memo talks about some of the state legislative responses to these investors and their policies and strategies. There's two different approaches that are described here. The first is anti-boycott, and the second is no ESG investment. So taking into account anti-boycott, the first bill to discuss is Texas law. In 2021, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 13. This amended the government code to prohibit state agencies from contracting with or investing in financial companies that engage in boycott of fossil fuel-based energy firms. So among the components in the Texas law, which became effective in September of 2021, the Comptroller of Public Accounts has to prepare, maintain, and provide to each state governmental entity, and this is primarily the pension systems in the Texas government, a list of all financial companies that boycott energy companies. A financial company under this law would include a publicly traded financial services, banking, or investment company. The requirement applies to any contract between a government entity and a company with 10 or more full-time employees, and a contract holding the value of $100,000 or more that is paid either wholly or partly from public funds of the government entity. The law requires, in certain circumstances, the state's pension systems and the permanent school fund to sell, redeem, divest, or withdraw publicly from publicly traded securities of companies that are included in the comptroller's list. The comptroller has posted a list on its website in August of 2022, and it contained the names of 10 financial companies, including BlackRock, and nearly 350 individual funds. So these would be index, equity, and money market funds. Also in August, 19 states' attorneys general, including then Kansas Attorney General Schmidt, submitted a letter to BlackRock's CEO in response to a prior BlackRock communication sent to several states that described BlackRock's position on energy investments with state pension funds. The letter outlined concerns about the goal to secure the best possible return on investment and concerns falling under jurisdictional authority defined for attorneys general. Some of those topics would include neutrality, duty of care, and energy boycotts. The next part of the memo addresses the response from the investor. So in response to the comptroller's inclusion of BlackRock on the list of companies that boycott energy firms, BlackRock responded that the opinion was not fact-based, noting that they have investments of more than $100 billion in Texas energy companies. A Texas Legislative Interim Committee, the Senate Committee on State Affairs, conducted a road hearing. They went on the road to Marshall, Texas in December of 2022. That committee was charged with reviewing investment practices of financial services firms and how those practices affect the state's public pension systems. Responding to a question regarding BlackRock's relationship with cooperative initiatives, so going back to investment strategy, and one example used in the questioning was the Net Zero Assets Initiative, a BlackRock official said that the firm maintains its independence with these types of groups, commenting, "We have one bias, and that's to get the best risk-adjusted returns for our clients." You'll see a little bit of information later in this memo regarding BlackRock's comments within the discussion of the Kansas perspective. The other option that state legislatures are considering and law has been created is ESG investment prohibition. So this avenue, the law would prohibit the use of state funds for the purpose of ESG or more broadly social investment. One such law is North Dakota Senate Bill 2291, also a 2021 law, and it invested social investments made by its state investment board to specifically prohibit that board from investing in strategies that consider ESG standards or from any other purpose other than maximized returns to the state of North Dakota. An exception that is provided in law permits investment of the legacy fund should this board be able to demonstrate a social investment would provide an equal or superior rate of return compared to a similar investment that does not include the social factors and has a similar horizon and risk timeline. The law also required the North Dakota Department of Commerce to study ESG criteria and to use it for its use in making determinations, decisions, or investments as it pertains to government and private entities in the state. So staying in this pension space, it's helpful to look at some of the other viewpoints that are present in this atmosphere, and that includes a comment from the Representative Pensions Administration Group. So looking to NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, NASRA makes it clear that it does not have a position on ESG, but has a more broad position on fiduciary duty that is assigned to state board and trustees and the ability of these entities and persons to execute their assigned fiduciary duties. NASRA points to a resolution that it passed in 2019-02, strong support for fiduciary standards in retirement investment systems. And you'll see a statement here from NASRA regarding supporting strong fiduciary standards in state that are set by state law and local governments, and supporting investment strategies for which the paramount goal is the financial security of pension fund assets. NASRA also opposes any attempt, either implicitly or explicitly, to direct or influence state and local government retirement system investments and circumvent the trustees' fiduciary responsibility. So before we look into more state legislation, it's important to also look to what the federal government is doing. And one highlight here beginning on the bottom of page 4, moving into page 5, is the Security and Exchange Commission. So in the same space, as states are looking to ESG investment strategies, the SEC has issued 3 rule proposals, both in March addressing climate risk and in May for ESG rules and disclosure forms to promote consistent, comparable, and reliable information for investors concerning funds and advisors' incorporation of ESG factors. The rules and forms serve, according to the SEC, to enhance disclosure by requiring additional specific disclosure regarding ESG strategies that might be found in fund prospectuses, annual reports, and advisor brochures, implementing a layered tabular approach for data for ESG disclosure of ESG funds to allow investors to compare ESG funds at a glance, and generally requiring environmentally focused funds to disclose greenhouse gas emissions associated with their portfolio investments. And prior to this rule, the SEC also has formed a climate and ESG task force within its enforcement division. So moving from looking at anti-boycott and ESG investment prohibition, what are some of the other types of state legislative proposals addressing ESG and also the broader topic of social investments? So in addition to energy, what other businesses or industries are subject to these proposals and law? State legislatures have considered other factors. These could include doing business with entities, limiting state government from doing business with entities that boycott certain industries based on ESG factors. And elected officials have also, and government agencies have also taken action. So we'll talk about a few of those as well. And I would note this is where the appendix comes in very handy. ESG is a very broad topic. And so you'll see some search data from both NCSL and a document they sent me yesterday that's very helpful because it goes beyond just state legislative proposals. It also includes responses of Democrat and Republican state attorney generals, treasurers, and some of those individual boards or others that might weigh in on this conversation. So looking to some of the state legislative proposals that have been out there introduced between 2021 and now, some examples are there are bills relating to financial institutions, including discriminatory practices and prohibitions. You'll see the list of those beginning at the bottom of page 5. The first, for example, is Arizona Senate Bill 1182, and it provides that a financial institution doing business in the state, either directly or through a contractor, may not discriminate against any person based on political affiliation or social credit, ESG, or similar values based on impact criteria. And then another bill reference is from New York, Assembly Bill 7112, and it prohibits state chartered banking institutions from investing and providing funding for private prisons. This bill was introduced in several forms in New York. I've also seen this in Rhode Island. The next area is firearms and ammunitions and their retailers. Among the bills, New York Senate Bill 2154 requires credit card, debit card, or processor service companies to allow for the purchase of firearms and fire ammunition with such services. There's also legislation reference here from South Carolina and West Virginia. And for example, in West Virginia, they moved somewhere else in the financial services sector to their bill would prohibit insurance discrimination against firearms manufacturers. Another series of bills relate to foreign governments. In Kansas, we've seen this as well regarding both Israel and Sudan. And in the case of New York, Assembly Bill 5886, it relates to purchasing restrictions on persons boycotting Israel and the investment of certain public funds in companies that boycott Israel to require the Commissioner of General Services to compile a list of companies boycotting Israel, and establishing such companies will be considered non-competitive bidders. In Wisconsin, there's another move here. This is regarding its Board of Regents and university system, and it is prohibited from investing University of Wisconsin system trust funds in certain companies associated with the government of China. The next area is social credit scores, and this is from our neighbor to the south. Oklahoma's House Bill 4201 would enact the Prohibiting Social Credit Systems Act. You will see a list here of what a social credit score is. This is very different from the credit score that you may commonly associate with FICO and some of those factors. These are alternative standards or factors that would be considered, and so the bill speaks to what those social credit scores would be. There are also study committee proposals. Louisiana has one to create an ESG criteria task force to study and make recommendations regarding the regulation of ESG criteria in lending and investment practices. As you might also imagine, there are states that are seeking to memorialize Congress through resolution to request certain federal and state entities refrain from enacting or adopting law, rule, regulation, or guidance that restricts the ability of financial institutions from offering products or services, in this case, in the fossil fuel industry. In addition to those state legislative proposals, and again, there's a whole host more in the appendix, there have also been actions taken by state boards and elected officials. In Florida, earlier this month, Governor DeSantis announced that the governor and trustees of the State Board of Administration had approved measures to further block ESG factors. There had been action also taken in July of 2022 and to mandate that, quote unquote, all investment decisions focus solely on maximizing the highest rate of return. In Indiana, its Attorney General introduced an advisory opinion, 2022-3, regarding Indiana's public retirement system and ESG investments. While the opinion acknowledges existing state law prohibits the state from considering ESG in its investment decisions, the opinion speaks to addressing its sole motivation of the fiduciary, which is termed the Hoosier's financial interest, and that it further advises any other commitment of stated purpose would be considered unlawful. And again, the oppendium includes some of those other responses. You'll see responses specific from the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. You'll also see, in addition to the state laws, and ALEC has model law, you'll also see responses from Democratic and Republican attorneys generals and state treasurers on this matter. So just selected a few rather than being very inclusive, will be exclusive here. The final part of the memo, beginning on the middle of page 7, addresses what you've learned thus far in Kansas and what the debate has been on this topic. And as the chairman mentioned, there is no current legislation, so we're looking back to the 2022 session to help inform the conversation. During both the 2022 session and interim, there were informational hearings and testimony provided by KPERS regarding both investments in certain foreign countries, China and Russia, and the broader policy of ESG factors and requirements prescribed in Kansas law. One bill and one concurrent resolution addressing ESG were filed during the last session. The legislation is summarized following this, including House Bill 2664, which would have prohibited banks or trust companies doing business in Kansas, either directly or through an outside contractor, from discriminating against, advocating for, or causing adverse treatment of any individual, business, or other customer based on subjective or arbitrary standards, which include political affiliation, employer, social credit score, or ESG criteria. HCR 5034, a concurrent resolution, would have had provided several findings regarding ESG standards and its intended uses and potential impact on the state, businesses, and families, as well as the broader role of state government. And it would have required a study and reporting by the Joint Committee on Fiduciary Financial Institutions Oversight. And that report would have been submitted to the LCC and then to this Kansas legislature had the resolution been adopted. The final part of the discussion in this memo is information that was presented to this committee's successor committee. I guess you're the successor, but your prior committee, the House Committee on Insurance and Pensions. So the House Committee held an informational hearing on the topic of KPERS investments relating to Russia, as well as ESG criteria. The KPERS executive director provided summary information on the system's investment in Russian securities, which were termed at the time a very minor part of the total investment portfolio. You'll see some data here regarding the size of the Russian investment, which was 35.9 million, or approximately 14 basis points out of a total system investments that totaled nearly $25.2 billion. There is discussion here regarding investment decisions. Those are, by law, a delegated authority of the KPERS Board of Trustees. And so the KPERS Board, as it approaches investments, works with its investment staff and external investment consultants. It regularly reviews investment information at its bi-monthly board meetings. And the board would be permitted, if it's so elected to do so, to decide not to, in this case, make any new investments in Russia. The board also would be in compliance if the legislature or the federal government placed requirements on future investments or Russia, or required divestment in Russian holdings. And so you'll just see some information there on how that process would take place. There would be some costs associated with divestment from specific investments, and those would include transaction costs and tracking error costs. On the topic of ESG and investments, the executive director stated that Capers does not have any policies regarding ESG investing, and it does not employ any ESG mandates in the retirement system's investment portfolio. And you'll see some follow-up noting the passage of the 2021 Texas law and what the impact could be if there was divestment from the trust fund. And again, those would be transaction costs and tracking errors. This would be specific to BlackRock. And moving along in the public equity portfolio loan for divestment of those listed financial companies could be estimated at $47.7 million to $81.7 million per year. On the topic of ESG and investment policy, the director spoke to the statutory language that would prohibit Capers from ESG investing. You'll see at the bottom of page 8, reference to KSA 74-4921, subparagraph 3. Monies in the fund shall be invested and reinvested to achieve the investment objective, which is preservation of the fund to provide benefits to members and member beneficiaries as provided by law, and accordingly providing that the monies are as productive as possible, subject to standards set forth in this act. No monies in this fund shall be invested or reinvested if the sole or primary investment objective is for economic development or social purposes or objectives. The Joint Committee on Pensions, Investment, and Benefits also received an overview of investment policy topics. This was provided at its meeting on December 2nd, and the Executive Director and the Chief Investment Officer for Capers presented information regarding the retirement's investments in China, and those would represent approximately 1.45% of total assets. Investments in Hong Kong would represent 0.80% of total assets. And you'll see some more information on some of the market values of publicly traded equity investments in both China and Hong Kong in the memo. The topic of ESG was also addressed again. And again, the officials noted the Board of Trustees have been having conversations regarding investment policy issues identified with ESG. And they noted ESG considerations are most prominent in equity-related investment mandates and can impact investors in 3 ways. Once again, it was stated that the system does not invest in any ESG-focused mandates, nor does it impose any ESG considerations on any of its managers. In addition to the statute that's been previously referenced, 74-4921, subparagraph 3, the Capers Board investment policy was also provided, and you'll see that there at the conclusion of this memo that there is a section on socially and politically responsible investment policy, and there are statements regarding both the fiduciary responsibility and the standards by which to judge investment opportunities. And it's stated very clearly that criteria other than these will not override the above stated policy. Mr. Chairman, I know that's a rather extensive review. I'm happy to answer questions now or following the conferees.
We'll go ahead and open it up for questions now. Are there any questions from the committee for Melissa? Oh, excellent. I'm sorry. Representative Mon, almost off the hook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Melissa, I'm sorry, I couldn't find a copy of your report. Was it emailed out or was it?
It's a part of your S drive and also published online. There are 2 files. It should be a file that says like CTTE, House, FI, and P, but I'll make sure that I'll help you locate that here just a moment.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Melissa? Seeing none, thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for your hard work and research on this. I know I gave you this task a couple of weeks ago, but you definitely came through with it. So thank you very much. All right, committee, we're going to move on to our next presenter today. It's Adam Maxey, Senior State Government Affairs Liaison for Americans for Prosperity. Adam, welcome to the committee. Committee, again, if you do have questions throughout, just throw your hand up and we'll pause and get those questions answered. So welcome, Max.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to stand here before you today and help provide a little more context and color to what can be a very ambiguous subject that is on a lot of people's minds right now. As was stated, my name is Adam Maxey. I'm a Senior State Government Affairs Liaison with Americans for Prosperity. AFP is a conservative grassroots advocacy organization, as I'm sure you know from my colleagues here on the Kansas State team. We have chapters in 36 states, as well as policy and government affairs capabilities like myself and my colleagues who can help you with issues such as this or anything that may cross your mind. If you can just reach out to our state team, and if they can't get the answer, we want to be a resource to you. So with that, everywhere you look these days, they're talking about ESG, whether it's on the TV, at their county meetings, if people are talking about this issue. It's not easy to explain. I know you guys just got a very, very in-depth run through, an excellent presentation. Beyond the obvious definition of the ubiquitous acronym, environmental, social, and governance factors, the precise meaning is infinitely flexible, presumably on purpose at times, to provide a lot of latitude for explanation for all these things, for the argument to be made to some degree to implement a central planning system in our economy, and some of the ulterior motives behind this. But the concept is not new today. This has been discussed for centuries by philosophers such as Adam Smith, Hayek, and Friedman, and you name it. Many people who have pontificated on the role of business in society have discussed this topic. In preparation for today, I came up with an essay from Milton Friedman in 1970 that could have been presented today and really covered this issue fairly thoroughly. But before we go any further, I do think it's an appropriate disclaimer to say that reality does require us to accept that there are going to be at least a few companies run by progressive CEOs or owned by progressive shareholders who are marketed to progressive consumers, and that's their right within the free market to do so. And they've carved that niche out for themselves in the business world. The issue, though, is with the mandates that it attempt to impose a single approach from the top down on business as a whole, or attempting to drive policy through other means. But due to ideological presuppositions and perhaps financial interest of big ESG players, ESG pressure is mainly exerted on public companies in the West. And I think you guys have seen that earlier, which leans to discern that there's little impact on companies around the world, the state-owned companies that have filled the void. I think we've seen a great example of that as in the global economy in the last few years, as these things have taken hold. There are other people who will fill the void. These needs don't go away. And you know, those companies are not bound by regulatory pressures from the United States federal government, and some of which certainly do not share American values in human rights or elections or democracy in general. And so those are things to consider. But I think we also need to realize that Washington, D.C. has for decades played a very pivotal role in allowing the conditions that have allowed places like New York and California to go ahead and implement some of the laws you heard about earlier. Regulations from the Securities and Exchange Commission, requirements from the EPA have set parameters for these companies in which it has given policymakers to say this is happening, they're complying, let's codify this and take it a step further. But in practice, some of these pressures can decrease investment in these companies, particularly in those in unfavored industries or opportunities that you're trying to go after. It's one of those things that the impacts on the economy, so on and so forth, and come on down the line. But attempts by state governments to interject ideological preferences into their investment strategies has left policymakers, businesses, and onlookers with a litany of questions and hypothetical scenarios. This can be quite a Pandora's box as you begin to open up what might happen when, or this and that, and such and such. And I know there are more conferees with better expertise than myself in the actual mechanics of the business or the financial institutions. These high stakes games of what if do have serious consequences for taxpayers and the economy, though. And the overarching question is quite simple. To what level do you believe government should intertwine itself with the marketplace? As advocates for the free market, we believe the role of government to intervene in the market. The role of government is not to intervene in the marketplace, excuse me. However, government is responsible for the management of taxpayer funds. And today we are discussing those funds are at hand. The fiduciary responsibility entrusted to asset managers is at the heart of the issue, and funds invested to provide for the current and future retirement plans of public employees, schools, municipal bonds, or any other purpose should be done so consistent with the best financial interest of its investors in mind. And I believe you guys heard the statute earlier, and that is it's what to achieve the highest rate practical to sustain the fund and to provide for the needs of its investors. When it comes to policy making, strengthening this fiduciary requirements and ensuring they are required and adhered to is the most prudent and honestly a very appropriate lane for the legislature. Alternatively, investing time and taxpayer resources into boycotts or investigations into standard business practices can serve to sharpen a double-edged sword that could be used against you someday should the tables be turned. We see that. You just have to look at states that are run differently than Kansas to see the possibilities. What can be done if too much ideological preference is interjected onto the economy by the government. But things as transparency for taxpayer dollars are important. When you're looking at how these asset managers or those fiduciaries in charge of these taxpayer dollars are voting in these shareholder meetings. Last week, I know you heard about some publicly availability about who these folks are, what they're doing, and I would encourage this committee as a legislative body to exercise their oversight in that, to ask those questions, and to look into places where you can strengthen the fiduciary requirements or the transparency around when these questions are posed at shareholder meetings, to just for the public and yourselves to know how they're being voted upon by those managing taxpayer dollars. The other part, of course, is enforcement of current statute and your, as I mentioned before, your oversight capabilities to be used on this topic by this committee or through other avenues of state government, such as the Attorney General or whoever the applicable law enforcement agency might be. But the other solution here is to realize there's an enemy in the administrative state and overregulation combined with pension policy politicization, and to focus on that rather than to attempt to use government to advocate for or to punish ESG type behavior. I think it's interesting to see as this issue largely playing out on Wall Street as you look in an opinion published in the National Review last week. Terrence Keeley, a consultant to a lot of these funds and a guy that I ended up reading a little bit about doing my research here, said the far more important topic of energy reliability and independence, instead of debating whether ESG was good yesterday, today, and tomorrow, can we please finish building critical infrastructure in California and West Virginia so that their residents can get the power they need to thrive? The private capital is ready, and as you'd expect, they're only waiting for the permits, which I think is an interesting take to my earlier point about the authority from the federal government that has allowed some of this environment to be created and these laws to be enacted. But the strengths of ESG don't change if your state is red, blue, or purple. Politicians of all colors should unite in writing investment strategies that don't help asset owners achieve their intended goals. And the solution here is for government and business to realize they have a shared enemy in the administrative state and pension politicization, and to focus on those shared foes instead of continuing to advocate for or try to punish the behaviors that you see fit in the ESG realm. I don't stand here and defend the free market because it is perfect. I do so because it's better at allocating capital and growth resources than government or much anything else we've seen thus in human history, and have proven so for some time, providing the most growth and opportunity for human flourishing we've seen on this planet in history. But taking steps into the marketplace is a very dangerous game that can set precedents for generations to come. Today's battles could be reversed, and those currently in power, as I said before, you could find yourselves on the other end of the heavy hand of government. And I think we should always be cautious when exercising that great authority as we consider future generations and the impact of what you may or may not do. But then acknowledgement that there's no law against foolish allocation of capital. Rate of return is the goal and intended outcome from all of the asset managers, no matter what they're doing. You would that they will run out of money if they do not invest it wisely. So in attempts to use central planning to impose one specific worldview onto the economy, for which we all rely on good services and our own well-being, are extremely ill-advised. Instead, I want you to remember these 3 points that with markets are better at adjusting and allocating resources than government. Transparency with taxpayer dollars is never a bad thing, like I mentioned, around the fiduciary responsibilities and the proxy voting and how those are managed, your oversight capabilities. And accountability and enforcement are necessary components, not just of anything you're considering here today, but for any law that you've enacted or is on the books that should be adhered to, as we believe in the rule of law. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has if you'd like me to elaborate at all.
Thank you for that, Adam. Committee, are there any questions for Adam? Representative Mom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, this is kind of a thorny topic for those of us who are free market oriented, because on one side we do have an obligation to protect our constituents and those who are investing in Kansas government funds, but on the other hand, we have people have a right to do with their money what they will. What do you think the role of the court system is in this type of in combating the ESG movement? And I'm talking specifically about when a fund is not or is taking actions that may not be in the best fiduciary value for their clients. Is this really something that informed investors should be bringing as class action suits, or is the role of the legislature to step in and regulate this? And I know that's a broad question.
It is, but Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'll do my best to sort of point you in the right direction. And of course, if you want to talk in more detail, I'm happy to join you offline later. I believe that the role of the court system should be used as it's intended to be done in all of government. Civil action by shareholders that they believe this plays out every day in courtrooms across the country. It goes back to your enforcement points. You do have law on the books that says to achieve that rate of return, and then those stipulations around the funds and your oversight capabilities are what the Attorney General or whoever might see fit to move forth and to correct the behavior. However, I don't believe, anything I've heard in other states and places, criminal penalties or excessive fines and fees are not the answer over criminalizing behavior. Now you're opening up 2 lanes in the court and the taxpayers' dollars in civil and criminal and all that. I would advise to steer clear of those sorts of things and let the natural course of investigation and enforcement take its place, as well as letting the private actors handle that on their own.
And if I follow up, yeah, and that's kind of what I had in mind is more civil enforcement by actual investors. either in a class action or otherwise, to be holding the fund managers' feet to the fire as to, hey, look, you're not executing on your fiduciary duties. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. We can do it by legislation, or we can kind of encourage by legislation investors to be to go down the civil enforcement route on their own, or we could encourage the AG to be able to look at that road in regard to fiduciary responsibility to the state. And so I'm just kind of curious as to what AFP's, what you guys thought would be on those various different roles.
Of course, yeah, and I would go back to if possible, looking at if there's a way to strengthen your fiduciary responsibility statute, and then again that these companies answer to their shareholders, and those private individuals and groups that, should they own enough of the company to make some noise, they're well within their right, and it happens every day in this country for them to question investments and want to direct that capital in a way that creates good return.
Representative Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as I listened to you and the other and our revisor here, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of a Capers trustee. If I understand current law is I have to exercise my fiduciary duties to preserve the fund and maximize return to the extent you can with all the safety concerns. So, and then I'm thinking, well, if the legislature tells me I have to exercise that duty, but I can't put the money into an ESG fund, is that actually going to be restricting my opportunity to do my duty? That is to say, couldn't there maybe be instances where investing in an ESG fund is in the best interest of the Capers pensioners?
Chairman, Representative, that is a very interesting thought, and I will answer that at a high level. I'm not going to get out of my capability here as to how to direct these funds to end a rate of return, but I would tell you this: it seems that your train of thought, and what I would say is, this body would not want to handcuff any investment opportunities in a strategy that protects the fund long term, as well as creates rate of return on a quarterly basis, which could include things that just so happen to have been scored as ESG appropriate, could fit into a portfolio, but defining that as a legislature is very difficult to forecast into the future, as hopefully the fund will be around long after all of you are in office.
Just to follow up, so sort of reversing that thought, if we do nothing, we leave it to the trustees to exercise their fiduciary duties, and I'm a conservative, and I'm generally opposed to investments made grounded in social justice or what have you. But let's say one of the trustees or the trustees as a whole did have those progressive instincts. And I mean, if they started to invest in that regard, it would seem to me then they're violating their fiduciary duty. And then the question is, what's the remedy for the people who they're investing for? And other than a lawsuit, which is cumbersome and difficult, that to me is the rub. Is okay, how do we ensure that the trustees are exercising their fiduciary duty, to put it quite simply? And that's the dilemma and the tension that I'm struggling with.
Of course, Chairman, Representative, you're not alone, right? As we heard, legislatures across the country are struggling with this dilemma. But I would go back to encouraging your oversight capabilities of those board members and with the state treasurer, and continuing to use your office and the information I believe you asked about last week to keep your thumb on that, keep tabs on it, to understand why things might go awry. I know I am not Kansas specific, but generally speaking, the legislative body, the Senate would have confirmation authority probably over some individuals. But to work with your colleagues across the rotunda and to ensure that people are on that board, individuals who are non-biased with taxpayers and pensioners' best interest in mind at all times as their duty and public service to the state of Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you so much, Adam. Thank you. You came from
I live in Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma, so that's not that bad.
No, it's a nice drive.
Yeah, it's not Missouri, at least.
No.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Committee, I do want to point out we do have representatives from the treasurer's office as well as the Capers office here. While they're not testifying today, they're also a resource for you. So if you have any questions for those folks, get with them after or shoot them an email. Their office is always open to answer any questions. With that, we're going to move on to our next presenter. It's Alex Orrell, Senior Vice President, Government Relations from the Kansas Bankers Association. Alex, welcome to the committee.
Hey, good morning, committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about my most favorite subject I've talked about this year, ESG. I wish I was talking more about tax policy and property taxes, but here I am. My goal today, for the record, Alex Orrell, Senior Vice President for Kansas Bankers Association, represent 98% of the banking industry, Kansas headquartered banks, but also represent some of the large national banks that also operate in Kansas. And it's an honor to be before you today, and an honor before this committee every time. I'm not going to give you a deep dive into the KBA. I kind of did that a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to try and take a global perspective on ESG as a whole. This is a very big issue, and it's very broad. ESG is very concerning to me. I'm being direct with the committee. I don't like ESG. I don't like progressive ESG. I don't like conservative ESG. There's both sides of these coins that hurt the free market, hurt businesses, banks that are trying to do the right thing. So how do you get to a solution? Well, our founding principle with the KBA and the banking industry is banks, and this could go for businesses too, should be free to lend to, invest in, and generally do business with any entity or activity that is legal without government interference. Banks should also be free not to lend, invest, or otherwise engage, so as long as they do not violate fair lending or other anti-discrimination laws. That is definitely targeted at the free market. You have a right to do business with who you want to do business with. You have a right to invest in companies and folks that you want to do, as long as you're following these laws. The KBA, we have been at the forefront of this ESG discussion for the last year. We have been working with our national association, the American Bankers Association, on this issue. I was actually the lucky state association guy nationally, and I got to go to ALEC last year to testify in opposition to their proposed model policy, the Economic Boycotts Act. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But this issue definitely gets me a little fired up, to be honest with you. But it's also troubling at the same time, because the intentions of some of this legislation that we've seen nationally and in Kansas are well intended. They're trying to protect core sectors of our economy, core businesses. And I respect that as a Kansan, lifelong Kansan. But the problem is with some of the policies I've seen, even going back to last year, are very punitive, are very broad, and create unnecessary liabilities for Kansas banks or businesses. Last year, Melissa, I really appreciated your presentation this morning. There is like 90 bills nationwide on this stuff. And it cuts both ways from you have to do business with oil and gas, or you have to do business with abortion providers. Both of these type of mandates do not work, and it cuts both ways. If You forget anything on my presentation today, there are three things I do want to leave with you. There is something we can do here at the state level. Bottom line, last year we were heavily opposed to legislation that was proposed for a multitude of reasons. One, it was introduced late. Two, we're grappling with this federally, and there is a big federal piece of this. And I hate even telling state lawmakers that some of this you might not have the power to fix. Some of this we need some action in DC. That's the reality, because when you're talking about the FDIC or the SEC or the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the state legislatures don't necessarily have authority over them. So keep that in mind when we're discussing these issues too, when you try and apply broad pieces to this issue. Second point, be wary. There are some within this movement on the ESG front, and talking talk show folks and other, some groups, I'm not going to name them by name, but they want to make this extra political. They want to pass bills that are awful, and they want to get them vetoed. I am not in the business, nor is the KBA, to advocate for bills that get vetoed. I'm in the business of pushing for bills that make a difference and get signed into law, regardless of who is on the second floor. There are some that want to take that a step further, and I have a serious problem with that when we're actually trying to address a solution and make change. Last point, recognize unintended consequences. Point of my testimony today is some of the legislation, once again, well-intended. I love my oil and gas friends. I love my gun manufacturer friends, absolutely. But some of the policies you put on the books could create unnecessary liability for Kansas banks or businesses that are doing the right thing. And, for instance, if I can go to a banker, Chairman Hoheisel, and I want a loan for an oil and gas, refinery, go to a community bank in Kansas, and he says, sorry, we don't have expertise in that issue, in that industry, or we have this scale. It could be a small bank, don't have the capital to make those loans. If they turn them away and say, I'm sorry, you're going to need to find somewhere else in this litigious world that we live in, that person could be sued. And they are guilty until proven innocent that they didn't discriminate against them, whether it's based on credit worthiness, scale, or just personal. Like I don't want to do business with it because I don't like you. You have the right to do that. Absolutely. So those are my 3 points. I gave you a pretty big packet of a lot of articles. I'm going to go through some of them here now. The first one I'm going to direct you to is on page 3 of my testimony, is regarding my president and CEO, Doug Wareham, who put an article out last fall in the Kansas Banker magazine, talking about this ESG issue being a pendulum. You swing too far this way, it'll swing right back and hit you in the face. Bottom line. It is, and once again, there are things you can do, but we need to be cognizant of that pendulum. And, Doug, I think, highlighted very well. Once again, we should be able to lend, invest, or otherwise engage, so as long as we don't violate anti-discrimination laws. It's unfortunate over the last couple of years, I'm not trying to be political, but the Biden administration, through federal regulatory action, is trying to make banks the police force, or try and put pressures on us to choke off credit to certain industries. That is happening. It absolutely is. And I got a couple articles, I'll get to that here in a little bit. But when you have that coupled, federal regulatory action, actual direction for regulation of our Kansas banks, and then you have state laws that push back on that, you really put us in the middle, in between a rock and a hard place. Who do we listen to? Do we listen to state law, or do we listen to federal regulators? That's a really tough issue for our member banks to deal with. They have the ability to revoke, FDIC insurance or downgrade and come and review. And, state law does not have the authority to do that. So very concerned on that, but I would definitely highlight Doug's article in here. The next article that we put is regarding in our Kansas Banker magazine as well, is a letter we sent to the federal regulatory agencies last year on this issue. We are fighting like heck, pushing back federally on this. We sent it to the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. Just to be direct, there is an acting comptroller. They're the ones that regulate the nationally chartered banks. There is no actual Senate confirmed nominee. President Biden did put forth a nominee that believed that the United States financial system should go back to a version of the USSR financial system, and was a self-proclaimed socialist. She said that. And so we have that type of belief going on in terms of federal regulation. We have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, that was created in Dodd-Frank with Senator Elizabeth Warren. It's very interesting that we have a federal regulatory agency that has the ability to regulate banks and businesses, that they have zero oversight from Congress. They literally submit their budget to the Federal Reserve to pay it every month, and there's no oversight. They slid in the side door of the Treasury during Dodd-Frank. So we do have some federal regulatory agencies that are definitely awry on this issue, and we need help. We need help with federal issues, federal oversight on these issues. Pushing state laws where we're, hurting people at the state level, trying to help them at the same time it's concerning, because, like I said, intentions are well placed, but you actually end up looking yourself in the mirror and you're hurting the person you're trying to help. So be cognizant of that. On page 9 of my testimony, you'll see the release from the SEC's website regarding proposed rules to enhance standardized climate-related disclosures for investors. First and foremost, they do not have the authority to do this. There is no legislative guidance and Congress approval to let them do this. And I'm going to tell you, in the banking sector, in Kansas specifically, every banker in Kansas looks at the climate. Absolutely. We have 208 headquartered banks, 146 of them are considered ag banks. You don't think they're looking at the water issues that we have in Western Kansas, conservation issues when you're talking about crop production on that land? Anybody that says that Kansas banks or Kansas bankers don't consider climate or consider conservation doesn't know Kansas. They look at that every day. It's in their risk management profile, without a doubt. These type of rules are using this climate-related disclosures as trying to push an agenda that's further than one legislative authority, but further than really what they're saying publicly on this, in my opinion. And that's why we drafted a letter with the other 50 state banking associations on our national group to push back on that. Doug Wareham, our president and CEO, is our head federal lobbyist. I'm our head state guy. And he is working with the American Bankers Association and the House Financial Services Committee in D.C., chaired by Chairman McHenry out of North Carolina, to call for oversight hearings and bring people to Capitol Hill to ask them why they are doing these things, what authority, and why. That is happening right now. So I want you guys to know that, because I think a lot of this ESG pent-up anger at the state level is in action in Washington, D.C. Surprise, everyone's frustrated with D.C., but there hasn't been any action on it. I do believe some oversight hearings and some hearings in Washington, D.C. will help be a pressure release a little bit on this issue to see like we're actually affecting change. Once again, that's what we're here to do. On page 11, I point to another article regarding some of our largest financial institutions in our country going to be subject to the Federal Reserve's climate impact exercise. Once again, where is the authority to do this? Why are you doing it? And they're making it sound like it's only for the largest of the institutions. And for the record, I represent the smallest bank in Kansas to the largest financial institution in the country. I represent them all. But this stuff, when you put in thresholds, which I know there's a bill floating around that has thresholds. Our industry has heard that before. This is only meant for the biggest of the banks. I'll use Dodd-Frank as the example. We know that wasn't the case, and it is now being trickled down to community banks all across our state, and with excessive regulation and compliance. You want to know why the rapid consolidation of our industry? I mean, there's 360 headquartered banks back in 2001. Now there's 208. Is because of this excessive regulation and compliance costs. Not against regulation. I told this committee that last time I testified. You're dealing with people's money. There should be regulation, but there should be reasonable regulation. Some of this is definitely intended to hurt banks, without a doubt. You talk about entry point for competition in the marketplace. Kansas has not had a ribbon cutting on a new bank since 2007. We haven't opened a new door of a bank since 2007. That's concerning. There are federal regulations that are stymieing those efforts. For instance, if somebody wanted to start a bank in rural Western Kansas, they would have to come up with $35 million worth of capital to start that institution. That's not reasonable in a rural part of our state. You should be able to start one with about $5 million, because you get that $35 million capital and you try and deploy it. You're going to be deploying it very quickly because you have to. And you might be doing loans you probably shouldn't do. And a lot of that's coming from the FDIC, where they want those capital requirements. We need to get to an environment where it promotes de novo, brand new charters in our state and our country. We're not seeing enough of that. I don't believe Kansas is well suited with 20 banks. I don't. The more access to credit, the more competition in the marketplace is going to benefit the end consumer and your constituents. So I highlight these two articles specifically from the federal regulatory agencies to tell you that this is a major federal problem. And we have people that are overstepping, and we're pushing back. What we don't need is also fighting two fronts. Fighting at the state level where people are trying to do the right thing, and I respect that, but also fighting at the federal level. I'd ask this committee, and I ask other groups that are involved in this, and even those that want some of these economic boycott language, come join us and fight. Come help us. Let's not just make political statements. Let's make a difference. So, once again, Mr. Chairman, get a little fired up on this issue. My next article is on page 14 of my testimony about a solution is in sight for the ESG controversy. This was penned by a gentleman by the name of Vivek Ramaswamy, also known as the author of Woke Incorporated. His name's been floated around with everybody about he's helping with these ESG related policies and legislations across the country. But I'll point to his last paragraph of his testimony. It's on page 17. A combination of pro-disclosure policies and investor education can solve that problem. Lawmakers concerned about the use of ESG in capital markets need not to ban it. They can simply require that capital owners be informed by their asset allocators whether their money is invested in ESG promoting fund and provide express consent to do so. He is not promoting some of the economic boycott language that we've seen across the country, but his name is being used as, well, he's helping us with some of this legislation. Well, he's saying something very differently as of 2 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. So once again, be cognizant of the facts that are out there and the comments that are being made. On page 18, you will see a letter that we sent to the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC. I did get to have the pleasure of testifying in opposition to model policy last year in Atlanta that the ALEC board looked at, or task force looked at, and the board looked at. And as of a week ago Friday, the ALEC board voted down the economic boycott language that was passed in Texas, 15-8 on their board, 2-1. So when folks are coming to like, hey, we're using this language that Texas passed and it's working out great, and ALEC is considering it, well, ALEC voted it down. So I want to share those facts. Lastly is an article regarding Bloomberg's from last July. It's in relation to the Texas law that was passed. When you interject the government into the free market, you decrease competition. I learned in economics that's not good for the end consumer when you do that. And Texas saw this firsthand, that their municipal bond market debt service went up by $532 million just because they're kicking people out of the marketplace in their state that they consider bad actors. It is never good to decrease competition and overregulate. That is never going to benefit the end consumer on this. And, on this type of legislation, it's very interesting to see actually that Texas put this bill on the books last year. And now there's like 6 bills that you have to do business with people that have ESG. You have to consider ESG. And so once again, it's going both ways, and both ways are bad. Government mandates and intervention on this stuff does not work. It can go back, for instance, California, or I think actually Arkansas, that had a bill that, the state is not going to do business with you if you don't do business with abortion providers. Both of these are extremely concerning. And I hope that this committee can see those concerns and recognize them. In closing, first, please recognize the federal side of this. This is not just a state issue. This is a major federal issue that we're working like heck to try and address. Know we are a resource. We want to be helpful. We want to be at the table. We're not pure objectionists on this issue. Never have been. And we want to get to something that actually makes a difference. Be wary of knee-jerk reactions and the unintended consequences associated with them. Might feel good politically, might feel, oh yeah, I did this, but what you're going to end up doing is creating more problems for the ones you're trying to help. And the free market, lastly, is a wonderful deal. You can do business with who you want to do business with. Everybody has that right. The state has that right too when it comes to investment policy. Absolutely. The contracts, some of the language I've seen is concerning, but the state does have a right on that piece too. You're taxpayer dollars. But ESG shouldn't actually even be considered in the portfolio. It should be not elevated nor discriminated against. It should be based on fiduciary factors that benefit those that get the benefits. Bottom line. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you for that, Alex. Questions from the committee. Representative White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Alex. I think you answered my question right off. One of the first things you said was the guardrails are legal entities. And I don't believe, doesn't even matter what the returns are. No Kansan wants to invest in a company in a foreign country that has slaves. So how do we, I think you answered it. It's got to be legal. You have to do a legal business.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine that guardrail is set up for our pension fund managers.
I do appreciate Capers being in the room, as well as the state treasurer's office. The state of Kansas is not investing in companies like BlackRock because they believe in their ESG principles. We don't have $5 billion with them because of that. We have $5 billion with them because they have a fiduciary legal responsibility to get the best return possible. Now, when it comes to some of the proxy votes and the state controlling their voting powers, there's absolutely something that could be done on that piece. But there's a fiduciary responsibility, once again, which is a legal obligation. The Capers Board of Trustees, so everybody knows, it's not just appointed by the governor. It's appointed by the Senate President, Speaker of the House. They all have, it's a very bipartisan group of investment professionals that do investment policy on a daily basis. So it's not a political group. They have a job to do, and they're trying to do the best they can. But when it's hurting the state of Kansas, or they're not having the most power associated with some of their, voting shares, they need to take those back. Absolutely. And we'll talk with the Treasurer's Office and Capers Board of Trustees. Actually, I think the Vice Chairman of the Capers Board of Trustees, former Chairman of the Kansas Bankers Association Board. So very strong banker, very strong, respected across the state, that knows this issue very closely. He's from Seneca and, rural Kansas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from the committee for Alex? Representative Mon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alex, thanks for being here. So, as you pointed out, one of the problems here is this is being pushed from certain areas of the federal government, as well as by progressive investment groups. Obviously, we've seen the power of the federal government back in the Obama administration when they did Operation Choke Point against certain lending companies, and you saw short-term lenders suddenly being debanked, and the bank saying, "I'm not going to do business with you," because they were getting pressure from the federal government. So we do see the power of the federal government being able to have impact on businesses and the everyday life of people if they decide they want to push a certain agenda on the banks. So my question is, what does your association have any opinion about what state governments can do to push back on the federal government? Because yes, you're right to point out that there are free market problems in us pressing back against banks and investment portfolios and investment funds. But perhaps we can push back against the federal government. Does your association have any suggestions for what state governments can do to push back on the power of the federal government to impose this?
Appreciate it. It's a great question, Representative, and thank you. Before I answer, I got a couple of comments. Yeah, choke point. That was real under President Obama. We're seeing that now. We call it choke point 2.0 in regards to the oil and gas industry. They are making this push in terms of also, once again, the free market argument. Same argument could be made for the Christian baker. We've seen that case. I think it was settled in 2018. The United States Supreme Court voted 6-3 to allow them to do business whether they want to based on their beliefs. So some of the legislation, I do believe last year's legislation would actually penalize the Christian baker. A lot of folks didn't like me making that comment, but it's true. When you throw those things on the out there as broad as they do, that would penalize, once again, the person you might be trying to help. In regards to solutions, I know a lot of people in the legislature don't like resolutions, but I do believe a strongly worded resolution supporting our federal delegation in their efforts to call for oversight hearings is needed. I would actually respectfully request one on that issue. I do believe it's helpful. When you talk about the Farm Bill, and I know this is, kind of getting off topic a little bit with the Farm Bill, if 17 Midwestern states come together and they say they want something, and the Farm Bill is an example, they get it done. If we can get enough groundswell of support of some of the Midwestern states on this issue, I do believe it will actually make a difference. So, one, resolution. Two, on pushing back against the federal folks, that's not a resolution. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's actually any state law that can be passed that's going to tell the OCC, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, the CFPB, the alphabet soup of these regulators what to do, or they'll care about it. I'm just being honest and direct, as you guys know me. But yeah, so Representative, I don't have a concrete answer for you. I hope there's some action in DC soon on this, because that's really where this needs to happen.
Any further questions from the committee? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope this makes sense. I really believe in the free market. I think it's great. I think it's okay to do business with Russia, but then we give Ukraine weapons to kill Russians. I think, something's wrong here. Just my thought.
No, I appreciate that, Coach and Representative. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is a tough issue. We need to have these conversations, and we need to be honest about what we're doing here in the state. And, when it comes to Russian investment policy, I believe there was a Capers presentation last year about how much money we had in Russian banks or, Russian industries. I don't want to quote Capers, but I thought it was like 37 million. That was like, we want to claw it back. We want to take it back right now. Well, the problem is you take it all back at one point, you actually end up taking a hit. So when you look at the investment strategy of, if you want to, you want to go take the billions of dollars from hedge fund folks like BlackRock, once again, we're not investing in it because we believe in the principles. We invest in it because they're getting a return. So if you're going to go through it, take that money, there might be a hit to the system when you do that. So what's your strategy if you do pass that? What's the message to Kansans on why it took a hit? Those folks that are depending on that benefit, what's the strategy? Once again, let's not make knee-jerk reactions. Let's have a plan on what we're going to do.
Any further questions? Seeing none. Oh, Representative, sorry, I apologize. That's it.
Thank you, Chairman. Alex, is there any chance that we can get kind of an update as far as the committee is concerned from what is going on at the federal level from the KBA? Can Doug give us some information about what he's seeing, what's actually on the ground happening, so that we can kind of judge what a resolution may look like?
100%. Absolutely. I'm actually going to meet with Doug later today, and I'll bring that exact question to him. He used to be in my position for 16 years. I think he kind of misses the State House a little bit. He says we have a lot more fun here than he does in D.C., which he's right on that. But yes, I will communicate that to him, and if he can't give it, I'll give it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Alex, if you can loop me in on that conversation as well.
100%, Mr. Chairman.
Last question, Representative Dodson.
Yeah, the free market economy has been kind of under attack, if you will, for quite some time. I mean, we all know that. When it starts to move into banking and investing, that's a different matter. And I'd be interested in knowing if there's anything in that specific area that is a remedy. Everybody will remember that government interference. Let's just take the example of solar energy, solar panels, things like this. So when the federal government starts putting in programs for subsidies for some of these products, that then disadvantages a whole other sector of our society, business. And that's been going on for a long time. Everybody has an example of that. That's the one that comes to mind as being maybe more pervasive, because it also encouraged things coming from other countries that were not manufactured in the United States. So this is an effort, obviously, to move the society in a certain direction of those who sit in power in the federal government. So I think in this instance, this may be going too far. I mean, when you start interfering in people's ability to invest in the things they wish to, and that's why I appreciate your comments about just let it alone. Don't try to regulate it. Don't ban it. But if there are specific things that we can do in these two areas, banking and investing, I'd appreciate the comments.
Yeah. Like I stated in the testimony, we want to be part of the solution here. Once again, we do believe there are things we can do at the state level that don't harm people and don't hurt the people that you're trying to help. You know, when you're mentioning about the free market economy, you know, a lot of folks like to bring in China and Canada into this conversation about social credit scores. You know, there's 4,300 banks in this country. 43. That's not the same in Canada. And, you know, there is a strong free market here. And, you know, I'd be very interested to hear, you know, tells of somebody getting declined for a loan. And, you know, it's a gun manufacturer, oil and gas one. I'm sure there's 4,200 other financial institutions that would try and meet with them and do that business. You know, we're not dealing with 5 banks here and federally government controlled banks. When you talk about clean energy, you know, the market is shifting. I used to be a utility lobbyist. Some of you know that. Worked for the rural co-ops before I was at the Bankers Association. You know, you look at the Southwest Power Pool. Southwest Power Pool is the regional transmission organization, or RTO, that you know, manages the grid for I think either 14 or 17 state region, all of Kansas. You can pull up their generation portfolio on a daily basis every 5 minutes to see what generation is actually being used in that region. On any given day, we're 40% wind. Well, there is a lot of clean energy being done. So are people wanting to invest in companies like that? Well, yeah, they're 40% of the market. Why wouldn't you invest in them? You know, and so it's not necessarily discrimination. It might be just like it's a business decision. They're, once again, 40% of the market. And there are these federal, you know, subsidies and things that have gone in place that have made those more attractive too. So that adds to it and, you know, creates a, maybe an unlevel playing field when it comes to generation. You know, I talk about a level playing field regarding tax policy and other things, of course, and we'll get into that today. But, you know, there is a little bit of a slant for sure. But is the public demand, is the public sentiment that we want more of that? I think it's pretty positive. I think a lot of people do want to do the best they can being carbon conscious or having an ESG plan in general is not necessarily discriminatory. It's when it's weaponized is when it becomes a problem. But if somebody wants to be as clean energy as they can and lower their carbon, that's their right too. And that's the right to invest in those companies too. So thank you for the question.
All right, committee, we're going to move on. Alex, thank you so much. You'll hang around a few minutes after. I know Representative Donahoe has a question there, so you guys can link up after.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we're going to move on to our last presenter today, Rabbi Moti Reber. Rabbi, I do apologize for the shortness of the hour here, but we wanted to make sure we get you in. He does have written testimony as well that you guys can take a peek at after. Rabbi, welcome to committee, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rabbi Moti Reber, representing Kansas Interfaith Action. We're a multi-faith issue advocacy organization that represents a number of the mainline congregations, denominations in the state, and also thousands of individual Christians, Muslims, and Jews throughout the state of Kansas, working on a variety of social, economic, and climate justice issues. So you do have written testimony for me. I want to make three main points. One is that I take a very jaundiced view of the conversation about ESG in general. I have lived through many moral panics, particularly around climate policy. I remember 2017, 2016, it was in the House Energy Committee, as it was in those days, where we had hearings about Agenda 21, which was supposed to be black helicopters coming from the UN to take away our car keys. So far, I still have my car keys. So I think that we have to take, we have to have a somewhat cynical view of things like, of things that become moral panics that have to be dealt with right away by legislation. The second thing I want to say is that there's a longstanding effort by faith traditions to divest their holdings from fossil fuels in response to the climate crisis. In 2016, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America voted to work towards a goal of discontinuing any investment by the church in fossil fuel industries. I'll also point out that the Vatican in 2020 called on Catholic institutions to divest from fossil fuel companies given their harm to the environment. I came to say to you that climate change is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. It's perfectly appropriate for investment funds and investors, particularly faith-based ones, to want to put their money into sectors that support their values. And one of the core values of the faith community is climate stewardship. And they are making those decisions according to, wait a second. In the PDF, there's a few links. I didn't make the copies of the articles, but according to divestdatabase.org, $40 trillion have been committed to full or partial abstinence from coal, gas, and oil stocks, and 35.2 of that amount is related to faith-based investing. So if you get in a situation where there's legislation that would say that we have to get away from contracts with people who have fossil fuel divestment policies, you're talking about possibly taking away contracts from Episcopal refugee resettlement or Lutheran soup kitchens or even Catholic. I don't know who the corporate sponsors of those are, but you're talking about a very sticky situation where you could be putting the state in opposition to faith-based, values-based decision-making around investments. And the third thing I want to say is that it's perfectly appropriate for a fund manager to take climate policy or the changes in the market in response to climate policy into account as they make investment decisions. This is part of the market, is recognizing that things are changing. The clean energy industry is growing. The oil and gas industry, I heard somebody say in testimony in front of the Senate Utilities Committee that the oil and gas sector is down 43% in Kansas since 2014. I'd have to find the statistic for that, but I heard somebody in authority say that in a committee. So, I mean, that's, this is changing. This is happening. To say that an investment fund can't take that into account because we want to defend the oil and gas industry, I think puts our investors at a competitive disadvantage. It is appropriate for financial advisors to take this changing market into account. So I want to make three concluding point. Oh, so then also, I linked to an article that says fiduciary duty is not an obstacle to addressing ESG. And I won't read it because time prevents, but it is in my written testimony, and also the link is in the bottom of my testimony. So I encourage you to look at it. It is not in the state's interest to punish organizations or institutions that take a responsible position on fossil fuel investment, whether that be because of the values they hold, or because as religious institutions, or because they, in their professional capacity, are responding to changes in the investment environment. Neither is it in the state's interest to defend a particular industry, no matter how important this industry might be to the self-image of the state of Kansas. Kansas is already becoming a clean energy bastion. 40% of our energy sector is already clean energy. And I applaud that movement. I promote that movement. I advocate for that movement. And I think that's where the future lies, and not in providing a rearguard protection for an industry that may well be past its prime. Thank you for your attention.
Rabbi, thank you, and thank you for condensing your comments. Again, his written testimony is listed in your S-Drive and on the website. So, Rabbi, will you hang around a little bit if anybody has any questions for you? Okay, thank you so much, sir. Committee will, Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be real quick. I just wanted to thank all the conferees and then all of the committee members for having a really well balanced and thoughtful and methodical hearing. I know this subject is in the news and divisive right now, but I thought everyone was very good and respectful. So just wanted to thank everybody for that.
Thank you for that, Representative. Committee, we'll go ahead and close the informational hearing. I have one quick announcement. Next Monday is the last day to introduce bills in this committee. So if you want committee sponsorship of a bill, we need to get it in to this committee, have it introduced in this committee by Monday. And then our last meeting before turnaround is February 20th. So we're going to try to get everything prioritized and heard and kicked out of this committee by February 20th. So we have an extremely busy next couple of weeks. So with that, thank you guys. We are adjourned.